Although he was only 15 years old, he worked every day like a grown man, hauling water, carrying burlap sacks, raising pigs and horses, struggling just to survive. Not only that, he also had to carefully take care of his even younger brother, but no matter how hard he tried, he was still just a child. After their seriously ill father passed away, life for the two brothers became harder and harder. More than once, Lucas stood alone at the door, staring blankly into the distance, as if longing for some kind of miracle to happen. Yet he understood clearly that with no relatives to rely on, they could only depend on themselves. In order to keep living, Lucas took his brother to a nearby market. He planned to sell the piglet he had worked hard to raise for months, even though it was not fully grown yet, in exchange for money to buy food for the winter. But seeing how young he was, the man deliberately found faults and offered an extremely low price, though filled with reluctance. After arguing for a long time, Lucas could only helplessly accept the price the man offered. Right after that, already short on food, Lucas immediately took the money to the shop to buy supplies for the winter. The kind-hearted shop owner not only gave Lucas's brother a piece of candy, but after learning about the brother's difficult situation, he also voluntarily gave Lucas a discounted price. But just as Lucas was loading the purchased food onto the cart, he suddenly heard his brother crying. He rushed back into the shop and saw his brother cornered by two boys, crying uncontrollably. Seeing this, the furious Lucas did not hesitate, grabbed a stick nearby, and struck the two boys who were bullying his brother. He then hurriedly fled the market with his brother. After asking what happened, he learned that the two boys had just snatched away the candy the shop owner had given to his brother. One afternoon a few days later, his brother suddenly spotted someone in the distance riding a horse straight toward them at full speed. Faced with the sudden appearance of a stranger, the sharp-minded Lucas thought it over briefly, then immediately stood up and ran quickly into the room. He stood before the long gun his father had left behind, hesitated for a long time, and finally mustered the courage to pick it up and rush outside. This was the first time the 15-year-old had ever raised a gun on his own. Facing a sudden stranger, tension, fear, helplessness, and unease flooded every cell in his body. It turned out to be the boy he had injured days earlier, along with the boy's father, insisting on the high compensation and saying that otherwise he would inform the sheriff and have Lucas arrested and sent to prison. Lucas decisively raised the gun. Seeing the gun suddenly raised, he said with contempt that I will give you 1 day. Either you pay, or you go to jail. With that, he turned and left without looking back. Lucas turned to look at his young brother and sank into deep despair. He was not afraid of going to prison, but he was terrified that if he went to prison, there would be no one left to take care of his brother. When his brother asked what they should do if the man came back for money the next day, Lucas thought for a few seconds, then comforted him with a firm tone, saying, "Don't worry, your brother is here." But after leaving his brother's room, he sat alone on the grass and cried for a long time. Early the next morning, Lucas suddenly saw a wild wolf outside the door. Before this, he had already seen this wolf many times, thinking that he might be sent to prison that very day. And to prevent the wolf from harming his brother in the future, he decisively picked up the gun and rushed out, closely following behind the wolf. Even though he was already out of breath, he still refused to give up the pursuit, because before going to prison, he wanted to eliminate every danger for his brother. After chasing for who knows how long, he finally found a chance to shoot, but what he never expected was that the bullet did not hit the wolf, but instead accidentally struck a man who suddenly appeared. Watching the man lying on the ground in agony, struggling, and then slowly losing his breath, Lucas's mind fell into complete chaos. In the end, he was sent to court, although he desperately explained that it was an accident and that he had only caused the man's death by mistake. Because of the conflict between him and the man a few days earlier, the judge ultimately ruled that Lucas was guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced him to hanging. At that moment, Lucas's world instantly lost all color, and everything before his eyes turned completely dark. He feared death, but what terrified him more was that after he died, his young brother would have no one to care for him. But at this point, he could only accept this helpless and unwilling fate. As he sat numbly in prison, waiting for the hanging 5 days later, a woman Lucas did not know suddenly arrived in the town. The woman tried every possible way to plead with the judge and the jury. She hoped that everyone would reconsider the verdict, given that Lucas was only a 15-year-old child. But no matter how she begged, no one showed any intention of reopening the case. With no other choice, The woman gave up arguing and came to the prison to visit Lucas. It turned out that she was Lucas's mother's aunt, his great-aunt. Looking at this great-aunt he had never met before, Lucas seemed to see a faint light in the darkness. He begged his great-aunt to find a way to save him, but she said she deeply sympathized with what Lucas had gone through, yet she was powerless to help. With no hope left, Lucas could only beg again, hoping that his great-aunt could take in his younger brother, but she said her own life was difficult, and being old already, she simply could not care for a child. After saying the words "take care," she stood up and left. The great-aunt appeared in a hurry and disappeared just as quickly. From that moment on, Lucas never saw her again. Lucas believed that he was surely going to die, but unexpectedly, on the night before the execution, a man suddenly rode into the town on horseback. Taking advantage of the empty surroundings, the man quietly approached the police station and quickly pulled out a handgun. Soon after, the sleeping Lucas was awakened by sudden gunshots. Hearing the loud and chaotic sounds of fighting outside, the alert Lucas quickly got up and looked out. Before long, he saw a strange man slowly walking toward him. Staring at the killing intent on the man's face, Lucas instinctively began to move backward. Without a word, the man tried to take Lucas away. Although Lucas also wanted to leave the prison, he did not want to escape in this way, but the next second, the man knocked him unconscious and carried the fainted Lucas out of the station. When Lucas opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on a patch of grass, and the man from the night before was standing beside him, holding a gun. Lucas immediately jumped up in panic. He kept asking who the man was and why he had brought him here, but no matter how he asked, the man remained silent, only skillfully tossing a canteen to Lucas. Already extremely thirsty, Lucas hesitated briefly before drinking heavily. Then, still worried about his brother, Lucas hurriedly stood up and tried to go find him, but the very next second, just as he was about to climb onto the horse, the man grabbed him and threw him hard to the ground. The man told him that from the moment you escaped prison, your life has no way back. If you want to stay alive now, you must obey my orders. Hearing the man's words, Lucas felt deeply wronged, because he never wanted to escape from prison. It was this man who forcibly dragged him out of the jail. But thinking carefully, if it were not for this man, perhaps he would already have been taken to the gallows by the sheriff. After much thought, in order to survive and to see his brother again, Lucas had no choice but to temporarily follow the stranger's arrangements and step onto a harsh road of escape. In order to find out who the man that rescued him from prison really was, Lucas took advantage of a rest along the way and stole the gun from the man's saddle while he was not paying attention. Under Lucas's repeated questioning with the gun pointed at him, the man finally explained his identity. The man told Lucas that he was his grandfather. After hearing this, Lucas was completely enraged, because from the moment he was born, his mother had told him that his grandfather had already died from illness long ago. Looking at the man who suddenly claimed to be his grandfather, Lucas was filled with confusion. Just as Lucas was distracted by doubt, the man suddenly made a move and snatched the long gun straight out of his hands. He then warned Lucas that if you ever dare to point a gun at me again, I will not let you off, even if you are my grandson. But the stubborn Lucas, who did not believe the man, replied defiantly that there will definitely be a next time. Before the words had even fully left his mouth, the man slapped him hard across the face. In the early hours of the next morning, while the man was still fast asleep, Lucas quietly got up and tried to run away. He ran a long distance in one breath, but when he finally stopped to rest, the man appeared behind him like a ghost. The man told him that this was a desolate wilderness with no people around, and only by following me can you stay alive. As he spoke, the man also described in detail the terrifying scene of being caught by the sheriff, taken back, executed by hanging, and struggling desperately on the gallows. After hearing the man's words, Lucas fell into deep silence. From then on, Lucas stopped thinking about escaping and instead followed the man through the wilderness for several days, until one evening, they unexpectedly encountered two men who claimed to be hunters. The two men chatted cheerfully as they lit a fire and brewed steaming hot black bean coffee for Lucas and the man. They even warmly invited them to stay overnight in the cabin. Lucas thought he had met two kind-hearted people, but unexpectedly, when he went behind the cabin to relieve himself, he accidentally noticed the hunters' horses. Driven by curiosity, he slowly approached and saw cured meat inside a leather bag. Unable to resist temptation, he looked around, hesitated for a moment, and then secretly began eating large bites. And inside the leather bag, he unexpectedly discovered a wanted poster. He slowly opened it, only to find that printed on it were himself and the man who claimed to be his grandfather. At that moment, the sound of a gun being cocked suddenly came from behind him. A bounty hunter who made a living capturing fugitives was standing behind Lucas, holding a gun. With no other choice, Lucas obediently turned around slowly. With a trembling voice, he begged the bounty hunter to let him go, but the hunter said that he really needed the $1,000 reward listed on the poster. Before he could finish speaking, the man who had always claimed to be Lucas's grandfather pressed a dagger against the hunter's neck. The hunter had no choice but to hand over his pistol obediently. At that moment, the other bounty hunter suddenly appeared. Faced with the life-or-death struggle before him, Lucas instantly collapsed to the ground in panic. Fortunately, in the end, the man who claimed to be his grandfather successfully killed the opponent. Although he narrowly escaped danger, there was not the slightest joy in Lucas's heart, because this was the first time he had witnessed a killing scene so closely with his own eyes. Staring at the motionless body on the ground, then turning to look at the man washing the blood from his hands, Lucas completely lost control at that moment. He shouted that he did not want to live this kind of life. At this moment, all he wanted was to return home and live a peaceful life with his brother, but the man calmly told him that this was growth. In the chaotic Western lands, every one of us must go through it, although unwilling to accept such a life. At this moment, as a fugitive with no other choice, Lucas could only continue following the man on this long road of escape. A few days later, they passed through a settlement inhabited by white settlers. Lucas immediately jumped off the horse with joy, preparing to mail the letter he had secretly written to his brother to let him know he was safe. But the sharp-eyed man grabbed him forcefully. The man snatched the letter away and angrily cursed Lucas as a foolish idiot, because the experienced man knew that if this letter were sent out, countless desperate bounty hunters would immediately come searching for them for the $1,000 reward. By then, their situation would become even more dangerous. Under the man's harsh scolding, Lucas had no choice but to give up the idea of mailing the letter to his brother. Right after that, the man instructed Lucas to stay where he was and not wander around. He himself then got up and prepared to go buy additional supplies. But just after the man left, Lucas suddenly noticed a crowd gathering not far away. Driven by curiosity, he could not help but walk toward the crowd. Only after getting closer did he realize that everyone was watching an execution by hanging. At that moment, panic filled Lucas's heart. As if he were seeing his own fate after being captured, the prisoner about to be executed seemed to be himself. His eyes were fixed on the condemned man's painful struggle on the gallows before death. As a fugitive himself, Lucas was instantly wrapped in fear and despair, because he felt as though he were seeing himself hanging on that scaffold. Overwhelmed with fear, he quickly turned around and fled the execution site. From that moment on, he no longer argued or lost his temper with the man who traveled with him and claimed to be his grandfather. Not only that, he also began to carefully learn various survival skills from the man. He finally started to slowly accept this mysterious grandfather who had suddenly appeared in his life. Seeing Lucas's sudden change in attitude, his grandfather felt deeply relieved. As time passed, they grew more comfortable with each other, and their bond became closer and closer. When they passed a supply stop, the grandfather even went out of his way to buy Lucas a spotted dog. Watching Lucas happily playing with the spotted dog in the distance, the grandfather, who had wandered alone for years, seemed to feel a long-lost sense of family warmth. And through their conversations, Lucas finally learned that when his grandfather was young, he lost all his land because he could not repay a bank loan. In his rage, he killed the bank manager and blew up the bank, becoming an outlaw forced to flee ever since. For many years, he lived under an assumed name, drifting from place to place. It was not until he later received word from his sister that his grandson Lucas had been sentenced to death. Only then did he pick up a gun again, storm the police station, and break Lucas out of prison. Listening to his grandfather calmly recount these experiences, Lucas's eyes had already turned red. Since his father's death, he had been raising his younger brother alone, living a life of hardship. So Lucas deeply understood the unspoken pain and suffering hidden behind his grandfather's casual words. One evening a few days later, they unexpectedly came across a wooden cabin. Exhausted in both body and mind, they wanted to stay there for the night, but were driven away at gunpoint by a woman, and the woman's son was about the same age as Lucas's brother. At that moment, already missing his brother, Lucas missed him even more. Before leaving, he gave his beloved spotted dog to the boy. Then, with eyes full of loneliness, he rode away and continued his endless escape, perhaps because he missed his brother too much, or perhaps because of the long days of hardship. Lucas soon developed a high fever and became delirious. Fortunately, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin and found temporary shelter. In order to let Lucas fully recover, his grandfather stopped fleeing and stayed in the cabin for several days. At the same time, The sheriff who had been pursuing them was steadily closing in with several deputies. One morning, after Lucas had fully recovered, he went to fetch water from the river and returned, preparing to continue the escape with his grandfather. But suddenly, he heard someone loudly calling his grandfather's name. He saw two bounty hunters blocking his grandfather inside the cabin, shouting for him to surrender. Seeing his grandfather in danger, Lucas was filled with panic. At that moment, his grandfather launched a sudden attack, and a fierce exchange of gunfire erupted. His grandfather then shouted for Lucas to run. Already panicked, Lucas took off without hesitation. Seeing his grandfather fall after being shot, Lucas stopped, hesitated briefly, then forced down his fear and ran back to support him. Fortunately, the two wounded bounty hunters had no will to continue fighting. Lucas and his grandfather narrowly escaped. After getting away, his grandfather did not check his wound right away. Instead, he pretended to be relaxed and comforted Lucas, saying the small injury was nothing because their escape had been so rushed. They had lost all their belongings. With no medicine, his grandfather could only roughly bandage the wound and continue traveling on foot. That night, with blood still seeping from the wound, his grandfather was clearly running out of strength, yet he still smiled and told Lucas that it was no big problem. Hearing this, Lucas fell into deep silence. At dawn the next day, while his grandfather was still asleep, Lucas took the gun and tried to hunt a wild rabbit to help restore his strength. But before finding a rabbit, he unexpectedly encountered several Native Americans. Surrounded by them as they circled and ran around him, Lucas forced himself to stay calm and shouted that he was only hunting a rabbit and meant no harm, but they could not understand his language at all. Before long, the Native Americans dismounted and approached him, speaking words Lucas could not understand. After hesitating briefly, Lucas chose to give in. He knelt down, raised his long gun with both hands, and showed submission. He wanted to trade his gun for a horse. Understanding his intention, the Native Americans examined the gun and gladly agreed to the exchange. With the help of the horse, Lucas and his grandfather soon reached a small town. Lucas supported his weakened grandfather into a saloon, then hurried away to find a pharmacy. What Lucas never expected was that several men drinking inside the saloon were bounty hunters, and they quickly recognized his grandfather as the fugitive with a $1,000 bounty. Delighted, they revealed their identities and demanded that his grandfather surrender. His grandfather slowly raised his head with a grave expression. Though experienced and formidable, he was badly wounded and outnumbered. Just as he was deciding what to do, several more men suddenly entered the saloon. They were the sheriff and his deputies who had been chasing him. Seeing the reward about to be taken by the sheriff, the bounty hunters angrily insisted on first come, first served. But the sheriff said he represented the law, and no one stood above it. As he spoke, he prepared to draw his gun. The bounty hunters also readied themselves to fight. The noisy saloon fell silent, so quiet that everyone's breathing could be heard. The sheriff drew first, and a violent gunfight broke out. Amid the chaos, the fugitive they were fighting over jumped through a window and escaped. He quickly untied the horse while calling out to his grandson Lucas. Hearing the gunshots, Lucas rushed back and leapt onto the horse, fleeing with his grandfather. But not far away, his wounded grandfather suddenly fell from the horse and crashed to the ground. The young Lucas struggled with all his strength to support him and keep moving. At that moment, a bounty hunter appeared behind them. At the brink of life and death, his grandfather decided to stay behind to hold the hunter off. He told Lucas that 50 kilometers ahead was the border. Once across into Mexico, you will no longer be a fugitive. Your brother has already been taken to Mexico by my sister, your great aunt. You can start a new life together. But Lucas could not bear to abandon the grandfather who had protected and cared for him all along. He stubbornly supported him and continued running. Despite their efforts, they could not escape the pursuit. The bounty hunter threatened to shoot Lucas if the grandfather did not drop his weapon. After hesitating, the grandfather reluctantly threw his gun away. The moment he did, a bullet flew toward them. At that critical moment, the sheriff appeared again. He ordered the bounty hunter to release Lucas and leave, but the hunter refused to give up the reward. Another gunfight erupted. The bounty hunter was killed, and the sheriff was wounded. As the sheriff struggled to rise, he saw Lucas's grandfather aiming a gun at his head. The sheriff tried to persuade him to surrender. The badly wounded grandfather proposed a deal. He would surrender if the sheriff promised to spare Lucas. After weighing it, the sheriff reluctantly agreed, but Lucas could not bear to leave his grandfather behind. The grandfather said he did not have much time left. He only wanted to be useful one last time. He told Lucas never to cry for me, because I was not a good man, I was not a good father, and not a good grandfather. Hearing this, Lucas threw himself into his grandfather's arms. It was the first hug of his life, and the last. He mounted the horse, looked back one final time, and rode away. When his grandfather was brought to the gallows, he was already gone, yet even in death, the execution was carried out. Lucas rode on and finally crossed the border, reaching the meeting place. There, he was reunited with the brother he had longed for day and night. I am a movie lover. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.